In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. In the lesson before us today, we will focus on the difference between the Roman and the Celtic systems of religious organization. To the Roman understanding, the country was parceled out into a series of divisions of irregular size, to each of which a church was attached, and to which church all the inhabitants of that particular district would belong. This division, called the parish, was the unit of ecclesiastical organization of the country. By far the greater number of the churches in countries where the Roman rule held or holds sway are parish churches. The Roman theory was that every place except a few extra parochial places was in some parish, that every man was a parishioner of some parish and had, as such, a right to attend the parish church and to have the benefits of its service and sacraments. The Celtic idea was quite different. They knew nothing of territorial divisions, nothing of the necessity for each individual to belong to some particular church. Their notion was not that the country was parceled out into ecclesiastical or some other type of divisions, but that it was part of the territory of their different tribes to which they belonged. On its share of tribal land, the tribe's monastic group would erect the necessary buildings, one of which was a church to which all the members of the tribe could attend, not because they dwelt within a limited area, but because they were members of the tribe and so had all the rights of that tribe. The principles of the Roman system was that whatever the size of the parish, whether large or small, whatever was its position or importance, all parishes were equal. This ideal that prevailed in the Celtic Church was very different. There was no notion of equality. All the churches were colonies of one of the great monasteries, and their importance and rank varied. First, in respect of the importance of the monastery of which they were a colony of. Next, in respect of the position the church occupied in the individual tribe. All churches were looked at as settlements or colonies from some or one or each of the monasteries, and belonged to that particular monastery in the sense that they were offshoots from it, or we would call them plants. And they were originally served by a group of monks belonging to that monastery. The head of that monastery was called an abbot, who was the chief. It is in this sense that they are said to be the churches of that saint who had been the founder of that particular monastery. It was not that the churches were dedicated to any particular saint. Dedication in that modern sense of the term was not known to the early Celtic Church. Each church had a group of monks attached to it. They were called the Caeladi. In Scotland it's spelt with a K, everywhere else it's spelt with a C. From among this group would be chosen one to serve as the priest in residence of the said church. All the other monks served in the capacity as deacons. So you have a monastery, then you have the churches, which are the plants or the colonies of that monastery. Then the next level down was what was called a chapel, which was usually associated with a particular church. I'll give you for instance. Let's say in Charlotte is where the main monastery was at, Charlotte, North Carolina, for those that are familiar with this area. And we planted a church in Asheville. Well, in Celtic times, it would take quite a few, or going back in the history of Western North Carolina, it would take quite a while for us leaving Black Mountain to walk to the church, which was in Asheville. So therefore, they would build a chapel in Black Mountain, which was attached to the church in Asheville, which belonged to the monastery, which was located in Charlotte. From out of the group that was set out to build this chapel, one would be chosen a priest, and the other two would serve as deacons. These were called secondary churches or lesser churches. And in these particular chapels, the only sacrament that you could receive, or there's actually two, was the Eucharist and baptism. All the other sacraments had to be fulfilled in the main church, which for us the chapel would be located in Black Mountain, where we could do baptisms or the Eucharist. For any other sacraments, you would have to go to the main church, which was located in Asheville. It is important to keep in mind that there were three distinct ecclesiastical movements within the British Isles. The first, the churches that were the monastic colonies, which dated from the earliest times up until the 8th century. So if you go to anywhere in the British Isles and you find a church which dates back before the 8th century, and the earlier it is, the more potential is to have been truly a Celtic church. Then you have the churches that were called the victorious Christian churches that are named after St. Michael, the archangel, and you have a lot of them throughout the British Isles. This shows the saint or the monks as they went out among the pagan people, and they win over the evil or the enemy, and therefore they'd celebrate in that particular village, that particular town. They would build a church or a chapel, and they would name it for St. Michael. Those we find from the period of the 8th to the 11th century. Then in the 12th century we have the introduction of Roman saints and the dedication of churches to the Virgin Mary. You will not find any ancient church in the British Isles, a truly ancient church in the British Isles that goes back before the 8th century, dedicated to the Virgin Mary or to any other Roman saint. It just will not happen. Now, one thing you will find is you will find that later times, as the churches became Romanized, they would rededicate it and give them the name of a Roman saint or the Virgin Mary. But if you go back far enough, what is good about in the British Isles is they had what they call charters, which I believe I'll talk about in a few minutes. And if you dig up these ancient charters, you will see that very, very, very few churches, actually their names exist till today, they were renamed by those that came in and took over afterwards. One thing I've always said is always remember that those that write the history are the ones that have won the war. You never find the loser end able to write any story about what was happening. It's always the winner wins. The following is believed to be the way the Celts would evangelize in a particular area. First of all, the establishment of a large monastery, which after a time would become the place of learning. And then they would send out those that were trained, these bands of monks, who would settle on land which was either been granted to that particular monastery by a tribe, or which they obtained land grants. Then there was the gradual establishment of churches. This was where they'd go out and start this church in a particular area. The offshoot from these churches was what we call chapels, or places only for religious worship, which were established or abandoned as the necessities of the case might be. Another point in which the two systems differed completely was the supremacy of the church. The Romans held that the church was in all cases supreme over the state. The Celts did not have that view. The Celts had that the rights of the church did not extend to protect the tribesmen in all cases from the rights of the tribe, which means the chief of that tribe could many times overrule the Christian church or the church that was in that area. Let's talk just very briefly about clergy. In the Roman church, each order was a privilege only conferred on a selected few. In the Celtic church, orders were a right. Any person who belonged to a particular family or a tribe could claim orders if he or she wanted to claim them. I want to stop right there and give you a good example. In the early Celtic tribes, they did not care who your father was. They cared who your mother was. And when it came time for you, when you reached the age to become a part of the tribe, your mother and her relatives had to go before the chief, and they had to take out an oath stating that she had delivered you, because the father could really be anyone, but the mother would know which child she had born. You understand what I'm saying there? So as we talk about the rights of the tribe, it may well be that the right to orders as a part of tribal privileges may have led to the number of Celtic bishops, each tribe having the right to give its tribesmen orders. Each tribe would have had among its officers a person who could confer such rights. In pre-Christian times, that was a druid priest. After Christianity would come to the tribe, it would be the abbot or one of his designated bishops. For we find that in the abbots would make bishops to send out and do rounds of the particular churches to make sure everything was being functioning and going according to the dictates of the monastery. This is just one of the distinctive marks between the Celtic and Roman clergy. The different idea as to the power to obtain orders. Under Roman was a personal selection of the fittest, or we have the tribal rights. It may also be understood that the tribe would also see that only proper persons were admitted to that order. We fully believe that this is a survival from pagan times, when the office of a priest was that of a druid was hereditary in certain families. All the members of the family had the right to exercise this sacred function. This right to receive orders independent of any special fitness for the post may in some way account for what appears to have been the very loose way in which orders were conferred in the early Celtic Church. We are told that Patrick consecrated 3,000 bishops in his lifetime. That's a lot of bishops. It is thus easy to understand why it was that the Romans so looked down on Celtic clergy and assumed such an air of superiority over them. The Roman priest considered that his orders was the reward of merit, personal merit, shown from this selection by his bishop, not a mere right, which implied nothing meritorious, but was merely the consequence of the accident of birth or of their position. It is at first sight a matter of surprise that the mark given at ordination, the outward and visible sign of a person having received orders, should have proved so violent a matter of controversy between the Roman and the Celtic churches. And I'm talking about the tonsure. Probably there was no single point that we find that caused more of a violent or more bitter feuds than the Roman and Celtic forms of tonsure. The probable explanation is this: the Celtic tonsure was some survival from Druidic worship, which the Celtic Christians absorbed and took over. The Roman tonsure was a circular crown, said to be derived from the crown of thorns, as opposed to the Celtic from the shaving of the head. If you draw a line from one ear across to the other ear, all the hair forward of that line would be shaved off. The hair beyond that would grow out down to shoulder length. It is believed that this was of a Druidic origin. We also must understand that when an individual would come forward in the tribe and be presented and be taken in as a part of the tribe, they would also have some type of a tonsure, or the cutting of the hair, to identify them that they'd been brought into the family of the tribe. To show how closely this idea of tonsure and ownership were mixed up, there's no better instance to be given than by the story of a young man who his parents sent to go see King Arthur. Now this is a story, but it is a demonstration or an understanding of just how important it was. This young man was sent to Arthur to make his submission and become his man, or to become part of the tribe. They said to him, "Go unto Arthur to cut thy hair," that is, to be admitted as one of the tribe. On arriving at Arthur's court, this young man came to Arthur, knelt down and said, "Bless my hair," or "bless me as a part of the family or part of the tribe." Arthur took a comb and scissors, combed his hair, and asked who he was. "For I know that thou art come of my blood," which means he was part of his tribe. Thus the admission to the tribe, the becoming Arthur's man, is shown by Arthur cutting his hair. What tonsure meant among the Celts, it was a surrender of their independence and admission of ownership, that they were now part of a tribe and that the tribe owned them. If this is borne in mind, it is perhaps not so difficult to understand the great importance that the Celts attached to the cutting of the hair and why they refused to adopt the Roman form. If they had, we must understand, it would in their view have been an admission of the supremacy of the Roman Church and of their subjection unto them. Since the Celts would not change and so would not adopt it, and it was because the Romans saw the importance that the Celts placed upon this, that they made such a point of the adoption of that form of tonsure. It was not that it was some idolatrous form. It was because the Celts regarded it as an admission of subjection that the Romans pressed it so strongly and the Celts resisted so strongly. Although at first sight, the fight over this cutting of the hair seems one of the most utterly absurd and ecclesiastical disputes yet. But when we view it in the light of how the Celts regarded it, and the light in which the Romans understood it, the difficulty of understanding it passes away. And it appears to be, as it was, one instance of the great battle for supremacy between the two views of church. It is also to be observed that both in the service for the consecration of an abbot and in the consecration service of the early English kings, a case of tonsure is to be found. In the service for consecrating an abbot, the use of a comb is spoken of as part of the ritual. Also, in many of the ancient burials of early bishops, before the 600s, let's say 900s, definitely before the 600s, you will find that they were buried with their crozier, and you will normally find a comb. Now, we also have examples of early Celtic liturgies that mention a comb being used in the service when the bishop was present. Now, there's not a whole lot of detail about that comb, but I believe by understanding how consecration was done and ordination and how, and I'll talk a little bit more about it, that how this may have been a vital part of it, where the bishop would actually comb the person's hair and would cut the tonsure, showing that they had been brought in as a part of that order. Also, during the consecration service of Charles I, it is said that King Edward's comb was directed to be used upon Charles. One of the great features of the Celtic Church was also the non-celibacy of the clergy. Probably the Celtic clergy are the only body of ecclesiastics who can boast that at all times in their history they have refused to have been forced upon them the doctrine of celibacy of the clergy. It appears from the Epistle of Gildas that the British clergy of his days did not profess celibacy, and it would seem that until at least 961 the marriage of clergy was not only not forbidden but was regularly recognized. In the canons that are supposedly the canons of a synod called by Patrick, we have one of the canons says that the church must provide for the dress of the wives of the clergy. Very unusual. In a poem that is written around 1100, one of the claims of one of the great bishops of St. David's was that he had 4 sons who all succeeded to the bishopric. Quite unusual. Also, let's talk just very briefly about what we would call today minor orders. What were the orders in the Celtic Church? Did they possess all the orders just like the Roman Church? Well, we know that they had the order of bishops, priests, and deacons. It seems clear by the writings that this was the way it was. But what about the regard to minor orders? It's not so clear. It's not clear to what extent these minor orders existed in the Celtic Church, or how far for minor orders prevailed. It would seem that they existed to some extent, but how much? In one of the writings, there is a passage speaking of the right of succession to abbacy, where it is said with something like scorn that he who was the next in succession of that particular monastery was a psalm singer, and that psalm singer could succeed to the abbacy. Now, does that mean that a psalm singer was one of the minor orders of this particular monastic group? That is what we think is being said here. And other writings that we have read, it seems to imply that there may have been certain minor clerical offices or minor orders recognized within the Celtic Church, besides that of what are called the superior orders of bishops, priests, and deacons. But let me share this with you. When we are talking about the Celtic Church, we must ask the location and the time, because it varied at different times and it varied according to the location. The Celtic Church in Scotland in many ways was similar to the Celtic Church in Wales or in Brittany or in Cornwall, but yet each church in each area had distinctive liturgies, distinctive ways that they would do things in their particular area. So as we look at the teaching for today, we must look at it through the eyes of what it was viewed to be a member of the tribe, or to be a member of the Celtic system. And today, as we look at the church, the Celtic Church, our apostolic Celtic Church, and it helps us to understand why our liturgies are a little bit different, why some of our teachings are just a little bit different, when we realize that they come from that early time in the British Isles when the tribe was the most important body that you could belong to.